In today's episode, I'm going to talk about why having a clear goal for your podcast is key before you book any guests. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for today's episode of Interview Connections TV. I recently was just speaking at Podcast New England, which is a regional conference put on by Jared Easley and Dan Franks, who host Podcast Movement. At Podcast New England, I did a talk on booking guests for your podcast and getting booked as a guest expert. And so in the next couple episodes, I want to bring you some of the key tips and lessons that I shared with the attendees up in Boston. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about why having a goal for your podcast is super important and something that you need to be clear on before you book any guests for your show. There are a lot of different reasons to podcast. I know that there are people podcasting because they are really passionate about the subject in which they are talking about, and it's not for a business and it's not for making any money, but they really want to get a message out there and connect with other people around that subject. If you're watching Interview Connections TV, I'm guessing you are probably an entrepreneur and you want to use your podcast to market and grow your business. Or maybe you want to build up a podcast with a large audience, you want to interview guests, and you ultimately want to generate revenue from your podcast, maybe with sponsors or ads. Whatever your goal is, it's super important that you know that before you book any guests. When you know your goal, you're going to get really clear on who your listeners are. And you need to know who your listeners are, who your ideal audience is before you book any guests, because you want to book guests on your show who are going to be a really good fit for your listeners. The really cool thing about being at Podcast New England was I met people who listened to my podcast. And we don't always have the opportunity or the ability to talk with our listeners because sometimes we don't know who they are. We see the download numbers, but maybe we see some ratings and reviews on iTunes, but we don't always have the opportunity to have a conversation. When I was at Podcast New England, I actually got to talk with some women who told me that they love my show, and they told me about some of the episodes that they liked. They told me, somebody told me an interview that they listened to and they really didn't like it, and this is why. The guest just didn't resonate with them, but then they listened to a couple other interviews and they told me why they really like those shows. So by having a really clear goal for my podcast, knowing who my listeners are, and then engaging with those listeners, I'm able to keep producing more content and booking future guests who are best for my listeners. So again, have a clear goal for your podcast, know who your listeners are, and then work to engage with and listen to your audience so you can keep bringing new guests that are what they want to hear, or that are who they want to hear from. I am Jessica Rhodes. I am committed to helping you leverage your brand through the power of authority and expertise. I want to invite you to check out my podcast, Roads to Success, at rtspodcast.com. Go check out my blog. We've got a whole new design up there. It's jessicarhodes.biz. I'm really excited that all my new branding is up and live online now. So jessicarhodes.biz for my blog. And if you want to check out how we can work together on your podcast, go to interviewconnections.com. Thanks everyone. Have a great, productive week. Do lots of interviews, and I will talk to you next Tuesday.